This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shin. You might have caught the new Ken Burns documentary, American Revolution, on PBS or at a showing near you. This film was screened at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. After the screening, Connecticut Public Special Correspondent Diane Orson led a panel discussion with several Native American historians. Today, we listen back to that conversation and hear about the experiences of Indigenous peoples at the time of America's founding. Let's dive into the conversation.
So, the American Revolution, as we just heard so well stated, is our creation story. It tells us who we are and where we came from. And our question tonight is, who was truly entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? We're going to explore the Native American experience with three people that I had the privilege of meeting while I was working on a Connecticut Public series called Still Here, Native American Resilience in New England. And if you haven't had a chance to check that out, we'll tell you about that later, how you can. But let me introduce our panelists. Very quickly, I'll give you brief bios. So Ned Blackhawk, on the end here, is member of the Western Shoshone Tribe of Nevada. He's a professor of history at Yale University, and he's featured in the PBS series, The American Revolution. He's an author of the book, he is the author of the book, The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History. It's a national bestseller. It won the 2023 National Book Award for Nonfiction, and it's been translated into 8 foreign languages, and the book will soon be available for younger readers. Loren Spears is an enrolled Narragansett tribal citizen and executive director of the Tamaqua Museum in Rhode Island. She holds a master's in education and received an honorary doctor of humane letters from the University of Rhode Island. She's an author, artist, and curator, and was recently inducted into the Rhode Island Heritage Hall of Fame. Under her leadership, the Tamaqua Museum received the 2016 National Medal for Museum and Library Sciences. She's also a contributor to the book From Slaves to Soldiers, the First Rhode Island Regiment in the American Revolution, and we'll talk about that. And Nakai Clearwater Northup is Mashantucket, Pequot, and Narragansett. He's manager of public programs and outreach at the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center, and there he develops the museum's educational programs. He's also the founder of Res Life Outdoors. It's a company that offers hunting, harvesting, and cooking experiences with a native first approach. And Nakai is also a very busy dad. So welcome to you all, and let's jump right in. So I want to say for many of us, one of the most surprising things about the PBS series, The American Revolution, is the centrality of Native Americans in this story. And Ned, I'm going to just start with you, but I welcome you all to jump in. Why is it important to center Indigenous nations in this history rather than including them as they often are, as we've often learned them to be, as bystanders?
This production is in many ways the culmination of a generation of efforts, not all successful, but apparent efforts to change the narrative around the founding of the United States. And Burns had not historically been able to bring Native American voices into his productions in the register that he's able to do so here in this production. There are not sufficient, I think, attention to Native experiences within the war itself. Indians are kind of largely portrayed in this series, if you've seen all 6 episodes, as antagonists to the colonists, even though many, particularly here in New England and in the Chesapeake, fought alongside the colonists. The Oneida of the Haudenosaunee were particularly central allies in the provisioning of Valley Forge, which we did not really hear about in the film. So there are all kinds of other experiences that Native peoples contributed to this historical development that are not as adequately kind of showcased as are the other elements of the series. The early episodes do have a kind of heavy emphasis on the centrality of Indian land to the origins of the colonial grievances against the crown. They do read from the Declaration of Independence, last grievance, in which the colonists indict the King of England for inciting, quote, merciless Indian savages to attack the inhabitants of our frontiers. This is the last grievance, the culminating climax of the Declaration of Independence itself. And there's not much about the legacies of the revolution for Native people more broadly. So there's not a kind of adequate, I think, incorporation of Native American historical experiences in the series, but there's at least an apparent commitment. And there are at least a half dozen Native American colleagues, and my wife is also featured there, as you may have seen, who were brought into the process of consultation and production. And so the early episodes do kind of highlight the kind of growing dissatisfaction that the colonial settlers, particularly in interior regions, have with British policies that come in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War of 1763. We don't really probably have time to really go through that narrative, but it's a kind of important series of developments in which the Crown is essentially trying to govern interior regions of British North America that were once part of the French Empire, that they've inherited following the collapse of the French Empire in 1763. And that decade thereafter is one of just constant turmoil and violence. And we saw some of that showcased with the Cherokee War of 1776. So it's really essential to the kind of narrative of American history to bring Native peoples into these conversations and analyses because they've been historically excluded. And we may all know the extent of that exclusion, or we may not, but it's really a deep failure of the American kind of educational and professional historical experience or kind of practice to have not sufficiently recognized Indigenous peoples as central participants in America.
Do you want to comment at all?
Sure. One of the things that I just can't get out of my mind, because I've seen a few of these excerpts before. So I worked with Robert Geek to write the book about the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. And part of my biggest pet peeve, and it is repeated in the PBS series, is that it says it's an all-black regiment, and that's not true. Not only were there Indigenous people in the regiment, and it's about a third, more than 70 men. So a lot of times, and I've been adding to the counting of it on purpose, because people think, oh yeah, there's 1 or 2 Indigenous men, but it's not. It's about a third of the regiment. And so I think that that's something that's often erased, and it unfortunately is even erased in this film. And I think it goes to, yes, and I appreciate Ken Burns in centering Native people in the ideals of creating a confederacy, the Native people in various ways in the film, as opposed to completely left out, which is what's normally done. However, it's still a problem of erasure within the representation of Indigenous people and the amount of service. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment, even for Rhode Islanders, is not the only regiment in which Indigenous people were within. So when you add all the regiments up and down the 13 colonies, there's Indigenous people in many of them and are serving in many different ways that are not recognized at all.
Before we move on, tell us just a little bit more about the 1st Rhode Island Regiment.
So the 1st Rhode Island Regiment is considered the first regiment for integrated regiment in the war. It was actually put together with a law that was allowing, and it was supposed to be temporary, allowing people that were enslaved to be in the war. That's kind of why the name of the book is a bit of a misnomer as well, The Slaves to Soldiers, because actually, even in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, there are enlisted African-descended people as well as Indigenous from this place, people that are in the regiment that are not enslaved. But
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I mean, why was it formed in the first place?
It was formed because they didn't have enough manpower and they were losing, point blank. And so they needed more warriors. And, I get asked the question a lot of the times, why did Indigenous people participate, considering the dispossession of land and the oppressions that were 100 years after, in our case, in this region, the war for New England that you might be known to you as King Philip's War, that was very detrimental to our communities and our sovereignty and our way of life. And so people ask a lot of times, why? And I like to look at it this way. They were spouting ideals that, if actually enacted, were supposed to also apply to everyone. And so I think, Ken's focus on the ideals, is a beautiful theme for a film, but we've yet to fulfill those ideals as a country. And so hopefully this reminder of what people in our history have gone through to get us to the point of the rights that we feel, or at least felt, in the 21st century, will then be carried forward to get to the actual ideals that we're trying to do.
Great. Nikai, I'm going to turn to you. The first time I met you, you were wearing a T-shirt that said, "Merciless Indian Savages." So that's a phrase that's taken right out of the Declaration of Independence. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this. And please jump in.
Nice T-shirt, right?
Yeah.
So throughout history and even present day, there's so many misconceptions about Indigenous peoples, and there's so much, even like today when in Connecticut, where we were able to create curriculum to put into schools, there's so many unknowns within our people. Growing up as a kid, in public schools, my school focused on Western expansion and anything Indian, being one of the very few tribal kids within the school. I had to be the expert on it, and I had to know everything about every tribal community all over the country, when there's hundreds of beautiful, unique communities. And so through this, you see erasure, as my Aunt Lorraine was talking about. You see, after the wars, paper genocide with constant literature being put out to get rid of our people and discredit all that our people have done for a country who, from that expert, wasn't writing those ideals and those notions with us in mind. And so, yeah.
Let's just dig in for a minute about this phrase. Can you talk?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in there if I can. I just think of it as a phrase in the Declaration of Independence. It's supposed to be about freedom and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and yet it's dehumanizing and vilifying Indigenous people and creating propaganda which really invites people to come here and kill us, to get us out of the way in order to do the westward expansion, which is their major goal. I think the line is something about major appropriations of land, and that's their goal, is to go forward. And in order to do that, you have to eradicate the people that are there. And so if you dehumanize and vilify the people, then it's easier to eradicate them.
Ned?
This is the kind of beginnings, literally not just of the United States, but of a system of racialization that will envelop all American citizens. Not just Indians being contrasted contrasted against the colonialists, but the colonists will begin constructing as they already have done. And it's somewhat ironic that there was no reference to race being a unifying feature of the colonial kind of cause in the film, because that is really one of the driving, animating influences that leads to that language occurring in the Declaration. By 1776, the colonists have been waging military campaigns already against the Crown, have been organizing committees for many years, have already formed the Continental Congress and now Army, and many of them have experience fighting Indians from the previous war, known as the 7 Years' War, which begins in 1754. Right at the time Franklin is in Albany, Washington is being brought into the interior of Virginia's backcountry in a kind of really haphazard effort to seize a French fort built near Pittsburgh called Fort Duquesne. That battle starts a conflict that will rage across North America, into the Caribbean, into Europe, literally around the world, as Spain will join France, its Catholic ally, and lose to the British Navy in places like Manila and Havana. That war is the beginnings of a creation of a colonial identity of whiteness that scholars are only now starting to kind of identify. The term white people had not been used commonly in everyday print or conversations throughout the 1700s until this war with France begins in the 1750s. One scholar has written that it appeared roughly once a year in colonial newspapers up until 1754. It appears about 20 times a year thereafter. And so there's this growing understanding among British North Americans that they are, in fact, a different people from other races around them. That is only possible once the French Empire is removed and once Native peoples no longer have kind of French imperial benefactors and allies and kind of governors to appeal to. And so the British are kind of trying to govern this kind of diversity of peoples, some of whom are starting to contrast themselves against one another in these deep and enduring ways that we're still living with to this day. And so the term Indian is in the Declaration, it's in the Constitution, it's in the 14th Amendment. You know, these are the foundational texts of American history. And that's why I was saying earlier, it's been an incredible form of what we might call historical malpractice, to not see in the documents of our country's most important moments this subject matter.
Just going to jump in really quick.
Please do.
Also, there's been so much negative propaganda on our people for a long, long time. You see early on when we're getting interactions within our community, you're seeing depictions of our people with horns, with tails, with fangs. So people are coming here already viewing our people as savages or not human. And then the Pequot War in the 1630s, Connecticut having to petition for their charter and patent to the King of England because Mass Bay Colony then wants to take Connecticut, and it awarded to Connecticut by right by conquest, reservation systems being started right in Connecticut. So the foundations of colonialism, like ground zero, is there and spreads throughout the country. The harmful erasure and propaganda has been there for a long, long time, long before Merciless Indian Savages was written in any document. And it's been a key tool for colonial people to use is literature and art.
That was Nakai Clearwater Northup speaking at the panel discussion at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, moderated by Diane Orson. We'll hear the rest of this conversation after a quick break. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we listen back to a special conversation with Native American historians at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. It was hosted by Connecticut Public Special Correspondent Diane Orson. Let's dive back into the conversation.
Could we talk for a minute about the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy called the Haudenosaunee? They're mentioned in the American Revolution. Can you just talk about who they were and the inspiration they provided in some way for where we ended up?
They're decent people.
They're our friends and relatives.
I'm happy to offer some perspectives, but
Yeah, it's just an outline. Yeah.
The Iroquois or Haudenosaunee Confederacy is the oldest kind of political confederacy or multipolar community in Eastern North America, if not North America more broadly. The Pueblo Indian nations of New Mexico have a kind of all public governing council of some form that extends back centuries. But the Haudenosaunee were organized in the 1300s, if not beforehand, into a powerful confederated political and social and community drawn partly on the shared linguistic, but largely on shared philosophical principles of peace, righteousness, and unity, in which each member nations contributes to a kind of national governing community held at the Central Council Fires of Onondaga. And those Central Council Fires have been annually kept since the 1300s. Principles of the Grand Law or the Great Law has been kind of recited every year since, recorded in wampum and other kind of oral traditions. These are incredibly rich kind of political and social philosophies that are somewhat well known in certain kind of regional academic and social communities, but aren't as well known as they should be. I think New York has a pretty decent K through 12 kind of curricular initiative that has brought some of these subjects into at least the New York public school educational system. But they remain then a kind of example of unification that Franklin in particular was familiar with because he was printing a lot of treaties that were being made through his printing house in Philadelphia with Iroquois or Haudenosaunee nations. There's some debate about whether or not the actual structure of the Confederacy shaped the eventual constitutional convention and the kind of form of American federalism. But it's clear that the colonists were very aware of this kind of political, not just militarily, but kind of philosophically about them.
Did you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah. I was teasing because my Haudenosaunee sister's right there. But personally, our people, we have very similar ways of life. And one thing, like Ned mentioned, that Haudenosaunee people are really well known for are their wampum belts. And wampum is really important to our people. And that's a really a story that isn't told much because for them to get those shells, to make those beads, to make those belts, or get those beads it comes from trade and interaction with our people here down on the coast. So these belts, when we bring them into ceremony, are viewed as animate objects of having life. And they have a vast importance, and a lot of people associate wampum with like Indian money and things like that. But for us, money is the lowest form of energy that you can exchange with an individual. And there's a lot of misconceptions even within like tribal communities. So a lot of people associate wampum with being the purple bead from the Puckwahog, but it comes from the root word wampy, white in our language is the white bead wampum peeg, purple Suckwahog from the root word suckai in that purple. And so our relations with Haudenosaunee people is something that I think we should explore more. And it's nice to see, our families connecting and growing. And I have little Haudenosaunee nieces running around now. And so, yeah, great people, beautiful history. And they are still amazing advocates for Native rights to this day and do a lot of badass stuff to stand up against the United States government and flex their self-determination and sovereignty as a people.
Including having their own passport.
Oh, interesting. So there's a clip in the PBS series where a historian says, we think of the American Revolution as a war against empire, but it very quickly becomes a war for empire. And I just guess in the time that we have, I just want to come back to this question of how it is that for 250 years, most of us have learned such a narrow and frankly skewed story. I mean, what does this say about us as Americans? I guess I'm interested in your ideas of like the psychology behind this.
Well, they said it was like a founding myth, like it's the founding story here. And we're a young country, as we know, as we're celebrating the 250th or commemorating the 250th. and you have to create your story. And I feel that, you leave out the negative things in order to uplift the story. And we do that here on a lot of issues, and people that we uplift that often doesn't tell the whole story, whether that's, I'm thinking Columbus in the moment right now, and the enslavement that he and his family started, the transatlantic slave trade. But we don't like to talk about that because it's part of our founding story. So we want to talk about just what appears to be the nice things that created this place that we now all live in, and not tell the full story, because that, when you sort of peel back the layers, everything's not quite as pretty or is sort of patriotic and is altruistic as we want to represent it as.
Mm-hmm. That leads into this next question. We're here tonight at a time when the federal government's calling for a review of 8 Smithsonian museums, including the National Museum of the American Indian. It's part of an executive order called Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History. And the executive order says that museums are, quote, replacing objective facts with a distorted narrative driven by ideology, and that the widespread effort to rewrite history deepens societal divides and fosters a sense of national shame. And so I just want to talk about patriotism. You brought up that word, and how that fits into the way we understand who we are.
I sort of feel like there's 2 questions there in one. I just want to talk about the second first for a minute. As Indigenous people, you might think, well, they're not patriotic because of all the atrocities that we've lived through, and that's not really true. We have the highest number of service per capita in this country since the Revolutionary War today. If you don't want to believe my words as an oral historian, feel free to look it up with all the departments that will tell you the answer, because I've done so myself just to prove the point of what had always been told to me orally. So I think Indigenous people are very patriotic. One of the presentations that I do regarding military service, there's a woman in our community that's very, very high up in the military, and in her traditional clothing, she's got a crown with the bald eagle, but the Americanized, red, white, and blue. Her whole regalia is in red, white, and blue, fully beaded. It's really beautiful, but she's showing her patriotism. So I think there's one side, you can be very patriotic, and then the other part of that question is not really about that. It's about whether we're going to continue to use tenets of conquest, and censure is conquest. Erasure is conquest. Forced assimilative practices is conquest. Using your power, military, weaponry, political, economic powers, and there's many of them, that's conquest. Using powers of entitlement is conquest. Greed for land resources, even people resources, using slavery is conquest. So to me, that prior part is about conquest.
That was Lauren Spears, Executive Director of the Indigenous-led Tamaqua Museum in Rhode Island, speaking at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History event. Coming up, the panel fields questions from the audience. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. We're hearing a conversation hosted by Connecticut Public Special Correspondent Diane Orson. She was at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History following a screening of the Ken Burns documentary, American Revolution. The panel took questions from the audience. Here's Diane introducing the first question.
We have just a few moments, and we want to take some time now to address some of the questions. So let me read one. Here's one. Does the panel agree with the premise that this was the most important revolution in history? Is this another instance of American hubris and or American exceptionalism?
That's really funny because when we watched the excerpt and that came up, I was like, of course we would say we're the best at everything. And like, yeah, we were the best at, like, it's so American. And, you know, it's not a bad thing to want to be the best at everything and excel at everything, but there are other things to be pretty good at that we can be proud of. And
Burns even goes further in some of the promotional materials. I don't think it made it into the film itself. And he says the American Revolution is the most important historical development since the birth of Christ. And so
it was in one of the
it's in one of the episodes, yeah. So this is, you know, it obviously it's helping to draw attention to the subject matter.
Yeah, that's a very provocative question. I think that there's this notion that's being perpetuated that this country is the only country that didn't have, you know, monarchies and power. And I beg to differ. There's a lot of indigenous communities that don't have that hierarchical structure in the way that it was being done elsewhere. And I think there's this notion that here, as America, is the only place in which that's been done.
Okay, thank you. What are the long-term implications of some tribes siding with the British instead of the Americans?
We all suffered the same fate in the end.
Well, I mean, actually, in a moment, why don't we explain some of that? I mean, in some ways, some of what the stories that's been handed down has been of an indigenous singular experience or a singular indigenous experience, when in fact there were as many experiences as there were native nations that had been here for thousands of years. So, I mean, let's begin with that, but also talk a little to the question of some tribes siding with the British instead of the Americans.
I'd say people process traumas differently. Some people get kidnapped and they want to kick the hell out of their attacker. Some are going to obey and do what they need to do to survive. So it's reaction-based. It's fight or flight. It's what people have different ideals on what they need to do to further their generations and survive. And, you know, us not being there, us being present day, we can't fault them for their decisions or their actions that at that time thought was the best decision for their communities.
It's a really important question, one that hasn't been, I think, sufficiently answered by the kind of scholarly community. And it was really nice to be part of a production that has some of the very venerable, like, field leaders who've worked for many, many, many decades to bring these subjects to light. And this includes, in particular, the Dartmouth scholar Colin Calloway, who's been publishing around Native American history around this period since the 80s. And Colin is from England, and he got interested in this subject just given his interest in British imperial history, and eventually came to Dartmouth, which has the most kind of historic or influential Native American studies program in Eastern North America. And they've, you know, he's done so many kind of prolific, he's worked so consistently to bring these subjects to light, but they haven't really been that sufficiently incorporated into other kind of scholarly textbooks or museum understandings or other kind of institutional settings. So he has a book called The American Revolution in Indian Country. Came out in 1995. He also has more recently written a very acclaimed work called The Indian World of George Washington. And has done many, many projects. And projects like these take, you know, extraordinary amounts of time and energy. And the reason why I'm kind of mentioning him is that you could read his collected works of many, perhaps 8, 12 books about this subject matter and not be able to answer the question that was asked. Mm-hmm. Because it's such a differing experience of Native American experiences in Maine, among the Abenaki. In the South, among the Cherokee, among the Haudenosaunee, there are divided communities, and there are kind of civil conflicts occurring within Indian country. We learned a little bit about that from the Cherokee experience in the film. So it's not a really easy question to answer, and it's one that hasn't, I think, been sufficiently asked enough, because there are so many experiences of Indian people dying in the conflict itself. The Wappingers were mentioned in this documentary as being at Valley Forge, but they lost over almost 100 men in the conflict in their Hudson River Valley community that isn't even well known in the Native American studies world because there were so few surviving kind of Wappinger community members thereafter. There's really a great Algonquian-speaking diaspora that occurs across Eastern North America, both before but particularly after the Revolution. Where peoples are Brothertown peoples who have already migrated from Narragansett, Mohegan communities are in Western Massachusetts. They leave. They head to Indiana. They end up in Wisconsin. There are Oneida people. They leave. They head to Wisconsin. There are other Indian peoples who, like the Delaware Lenape, who've already migrated west. There's a kind of continental remaking of indigenous North America, in part because of these kind of settler pressures that the revolution in many ways is the culmination of.
So we have 2 minutes, and I want to, no, don't, please don't apologize. But I do want to ask you, Ned, before we wrap up, what was it like working on this series?
I wasn't that centrally involved, and I kind of had forgotten about it because they had interviewed us so many years ago. I knew they were kind of shooting for 2026, and I don't want to be a little too kind of self-centering around this subject. But they had done recently, before this project, a biography of Benjamin Franklin that perhaps some in the audience had seen. It's a 2-series kind of biographical history of Benjamin Franklin. And like I said earlier, Burns is not known for having in Native American historical kind of incorporation in most of his productions. The National Park film, which literally is about the dispossession of Native American reservation lands like Glacier from the Blackfeet or Yosemite, it's called America's Best Idea, right? So he's kind of and the Civil War, which made him supremely famous, has no Western theaters to it, like Sand Creek Massacre or the Dakota Uprising or the Hanging at Mankato, the Bear River Massacre. We could go on and on about the kind of Civil War components of Indian history. So you asked this question, so I'm answering it at some length. They work trying to get Indian kind of content into the Franklin production, but it didn't feel right to take a biography of a founding figure and use that as the frame, and then approach people later in the process and say, "Hey, we'd really like something about Indians in this." And
yeah, right.
so a lot of people kind of balked, and the production really didn't generate much, I think, influence. Unlike this one, which is really being widely viewed, and it feels like a kind of form of cultural production that is unifying people at a time of extreme challenges around national identity and so forth. So when the people who approached us about the Franklin series, they said, "Oh, we're doing the Revolution next." Then people kind of, "Oh, the Revolution, okay. You can't obviously tell that story without Native peoples, right?" And so we, the team of people that we weren't organized really, but we all kind of know one another, like Colin at Dartmouth, Kathleen Duvall at Chapel Hill, Michael Whitkin, who was at Columbia, is featured, Phil Deloria, who's at Harvard. A lot of us know one another. And so we kind of all started saying, "Okay, let's do this." And so some folks like Alan Taylor, who's the central narrator basically, became more kind of influential in the kind of drafting and reviewing of scripts. Others were just brought in periodically for. So I've never actually met Ken Burns, which I will do, as I was going to mention.
Why don't you mention that?
We are trying to do a kind of 26 commemoration, focusing on the legacies of the Declaration for Native Peoples in March. And we just kind of confirmed Burns' participation. We'll probably show more of the Native content film at that sessions. But he is going to come to town with David Schmidt, the co-director, who had gone to Dartmouth and is actually Colin Calloway's former student. And so that's the way these kind of genealogies sometimes unfold, is that it's the students of folks who sometimes bring it to the attention of perhaps people in influence and say, hey, let's make sure we do this differently.
That was Ned Blackhawk, professor of history at Yale University and author of The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples and the Unmaking of U.S. History. He spoke at a panel with Lauren Spears and Nakai Clearwater Northup. Connecticut Public Special Correspondent Diane Orson moderated a discussion at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.